Whilst people are moving to microphone stands, I will ask the first question. I'd like to ask it of Peter, and it might be a little bit mischievous of me because I kind of have asked him before and know the answer. But I wonder whether I could ask you your thoughts on residential in the City of London, the residential, high-rise residential development in the City of London, and perhaps other than the Barbican and one or two others, why that's not been embraced in the way that I think many cities around the world have embraced residential into the city centre.
Yes, it always surprises people, especially in the US, when I explained that the City of London is almost exclusively business-focused and that we don't have a significant number of residents. And they always say, oh, yes, but the new norm is mixed use. You have to have residents downtown. Well, of course, that's true, and London does have very large numbers of residents downtown in terms of central London as a whole. But the City of London's rather unusual. We not only have a vote for residents, we have a business vote. So the businesses do actually get to elect their representatives on the council within the City of London. And that's unique in the world, I believe, except I believe that the City of Melbourne does something similar in their central area. But it's almost unique. And that means that the city has a business focus, and its primary aim is to meet the needs and the changing needs of business. Now, when you introduce residents downtown, residents like to become NIMBYs. It doesn't take long. That takes less than 3 weeks to become a NIMBY. And residents will then start to complain about redevelopment and about plant going onto buildings at weekends and the servicing and all the other things that happen. So I believe there are some areas of cities that should be protected from residents, because residents can do an enormous amount of harm. And the two areas that I think of are areas for nightlife and areas for business. Nightlife and business are the things that make cities function. Young people come to work in London because the nightlife is good. That's the reason they come here. They get jobs to pay for the party. That's secondary as far as they're concerned. So Soho and the City of London are the two most important things that London has. Now, residents don't like nightlife because it disturbs their sleep. That's understandable. Residents don't like constant redevelopment as buildings change to meet modern technology. Now, if you combine business use with nightlife in the same place in the City of London, I think you have the best of both worlds. We have the vibrancy, we have the vitality, and we don't disturb large numbers of residents. So the residents we have in the city are located in areas where they can be given a residential amenity, and they're separate from the commercial areas and away from the nightlife. And I want to end by saying I'm a total hypocrite because in August I move into a flat less than 200 metres behind me on the 27th floor of the Heron. So some of us live in the City of London.
Yes, Aldo Norsa from the University of Venice. We will in November dedicate a one-day discussion to Milan, to the Porta Nuova. It is developed by Heinz and now by Qatar Developments. What I'm asking from Mr. Peter Wynne Rees, we've heard some of a comparison with Frankfurt. There are other cities in Europe, Paris, Madrid, for example, where tall buildings have been built. In Paris, La Défense was already an occasion. It started earlier than in London, Puerta del Sol in Madrid. There are different approaches. We can no longer call them central business districts because it's not that concept, that American concept. But these are historic cities with different approaches. Besides Frankfurt, do you have other comments? Thank you. On these other examples.
As I said earlier, I don't believe you have to build tall to have a successful city. There are many heritage cities, and Venice would be a very good example, where you cannot dream that people would build tall in Venice. I mean, I know there are problems with foundations anyway, but I can't think that a tall building is going to do much to add to what Venice already offers. Milan has already at least one tall building that is a heritage building. Nervi's great work in Milan. And there are examples throughout Italy where tall buildings of very fine architecture have become adopted as icons within those cities. I think when you have to resort to building your business district outside your city, then I think you start to create problems. There are times, and London has gone through those times, when we couldn't accommodate all the offices that wished to be in London in the centre, either in the West End or in the city. And so we had to create satellite developments. In the 1970s it was Croydon, in the 1990s Canary Wharf. These areas are all brand new at the same time. All the buildings are built at roughly the same time. And they become old at the same time. So it becomes very difficult to relaunch those areas when the buildings age. Equally, when people are offered the choice of working downtown or in an out-of-town location, they seem to choose downtown every time, because downtown is where the party is. And as I was saying in my last answer, if you cannot connect the party and the workplace, then people won't want to go to work. Remember, going to work is the main part of people's social lives. That's where they meet their friends. As we have family breakdown throughout the world, people focus on the workplace for their social needs. And so they do like to party together as well as to work together. And if you can bring those two together, then that's the spark that brings a place alive. And that's what we're talking about after all. It's making places and keeping places healthy. Perhaps we can talk more about this later. Well, I wouldn't say no to a trip to Venice.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Question from June Palafox there.
June Palafox from the Philippines. Great presentations, thank you. For Mr. Rees, Peter, the high-rise buildings here are so nice. They know how to meet the ground, the public realm. Question is, the surrounding low-rise, medium-rise buildings, these tall buildings sort of take away the redevelopment potential of the surroundings to go taller. Question, is there such a thing as impact fees to subsidize the low-rise buildings to remain shorter? And secondly, what's the highest floor area ratio allowed or plant ratio allowed for these tall buildings? Thank you.
Well, I don't want to hog the whole session, so I hope I can pass some of this one along. But just to say very quickly, we don't have a plot ratio in the city. I managed to get that abolished back in the 1980s. The problem with having a plot ratio, or an FAR as it's called in the US, is that people will find ways of building to that FAR and then making buildings bigger. In London, we found that people were building buildings over railway lines, over roads, using air rights, and then creating giant atriums in the middle of their buildings, which made the buildings even bigger for the same plot ratio. So we decided we would abolish the plot ratio and simply judge each building on its merits. So there is no entitlement. And as I said earlier, we don't have a planning system where you have an entitlement to a development. You have to use your ingenuity to persuade us that it's the right thing to do, which means automatically that people engage a very good architect in order to convince the planners, if nothing else. And we will then look at the building in its relationship to its surroundings. There are areas of the city that will remain low, and the value of those areas is reflected by the fact that it has heritage buildings on it. But the leisure activities in those areas and the smaller offices also make money. It's just that you don't have a set value on each site, nor an entitlement to a plot ratio. That's one of the advantages of having our loose, informal, reactive planning system.
I mean, I can add to that. I mean, I think the case in London for tall buildings, as we talked about, is economically very, very challenging. You know, the rents that you would achieve in a tall building relative to the rents we can achieve in a more moderate height building, maybe there's 5 to 10% difference in them. Whereas if you look at the relative cost of a tall building to a lower rise building, there's probably a greater differential than that. So I think the case for the lower rise building will continue, not just from a planning constraint perspective, but also from a commercial perspective. I also think, as Peter talked earlier about the kind of pent-up demand that exists within London in terms of there being a reduced amount of supply coming through to actually meet that tenant demand. And you have to remember that the lower-rise building can be built, can unless we go through planning quicker, but it can certainly be delivered quicker, has less economic constraints, and therefore it has the advantage in terms of speed to market. So I think we certainly are seeing it in the city, what are lower-rise schemes coming forwards, not just whether they're constrained by planning, but also because they're advantageous to, from an investor and developer to meet those tenant demands. So I don't think London will ever be a story of every developer or investor trying to drive, building tall buildings.
Carmine, do you have a comment on that?
I mean, my only comment would be is that corporations look for flexibility, and the predictability of the marketplace for us is incredibly difficult. How much square footage we need today versus tomorrow, how we're going to grow, how we're going to shrink, is the nightmare that I live with every day. And so flexibility is important, and obviously in a taller, bigger building, you have more options. The smaller buildings limit you. We used to have sort of a campus in the city where we had stuff in, going back 15 years ago in different buildings, and it's very difficult to operate that way. Very, very difficult. So for us, for large corporations, flexibility, size, options of growth, and/or shrinkage is critical. I do worry a little bit. I don't know if worry is the right word, but I still consider myself somewhat a visitor, even though I'm here 12 years. With all the building that's going on around our Lime Street building, the low-rise is disappearing over there, and some of those buildings were really quite nice. And I think the nature's changing. And on the other hand, the modern London that's evolving is magnificent. So the piazzas and the things that we're able to do in and around there are fantastic. So I think you have a difficult job in taking a look at what you allow to be saved and whatnot. It's not easy.
Okay, well, I have another question. Again, I guess slightly mischievous. I like to address this to all three. I think one of the topics that we've tried to engage in this conference overall, and I think Carmine touched on this in his presentation, and actually there's the final panel session tomorrow afternoon. This is the title of the topic is tall buildings as heritage. Because when you look at the conference theme, height and heritage, unique challenges of building tall in historic cities, I think one tends to think of the negative impact that tall building has on heritage, which is probably the European view. However, in most American cities, the tall buildings are the heritage. And we heard there about Sears and the impact that had on the psyche of Chicago by changing the name from Sears to Willis, even though Sears was essentially a company that kind of went out of vogue 20 years ago. That was still quite an emotive thing. So my question is, going back to the whole Prince Charles things from 12 years ago, do you believe that the tall buildings that are being built in this city today will become embraced into heritage in the same way that Sears, ex-Sears, or Chrysler, or Empire State, or these monuments of architecture in America have become, included into the psyche of that nation? And going further, I'd like to draw you on which of the tall buildings being built in the city today, or built in London today, do you think actually has got the greatest chance of being embraced into the psyche? And I would add, maybe not to choose your own building, to Carmine and Richard. So let's start from Carmine and work back to Richard. Which building do you think has most chance?
I want to address it a little bit differently in that, you heard me speak about branding. And branding is an adult concept. It's a business concept. And there's a line between when something is a great piece of architecture and a building like the Gherkin has taken on the name of the Gherkin. It hasn't taken on the name of Swiss Re so much. And when you brand things the way we do, and when you brand things the way Sears did, it's a business idea and it's subject to change. And that's what Chicago encountered. They've encountered it with other buildings there. The building that became Macy's was, I forget the department store. It was traumatic. It was traumatic to the population. The Sears name was traumatic to the population. The business community understood it and embraced it. The mayor understood it and embraced it. The landlords understood it and embraced it. It may not be a concept that we like as architects. You know, we want the building to be iconic and be there because A, it's a great piece of architecture, or it has a fabulous setting, or it's had a fabulous usage, or whatever it may be. The reality is that when you get into this naming buildings, that they're subject to change. 20 years from now, it might become the Google building. And that's just sort of the reality of the free market. And I think that's an important thing when you start looking at heritage. It's a different, and in that sense, a new heritage in that regard. It's a little bit different here because you do use the nickname more than the company name. Some of the buildings have transcended that in New York. The Freedom Tower is one. It's just too big for one company to take it, so therefore it's been given its own name. The Empire State Building really is not, that's a Gherkin type name. The Chrysler Building, it just, it's stuck. I think that's the one thing that I think is, I don't want to say a shame, but it's something that we have to face up to and deal with as business people. In the end, the city is about business from a free market point of view, and I think that that's a concern. So heritage has to be adapted and understand what is the heritage of a tall building. It may in fact be that there's a legacy of the Sears, Willis, Google building that may be the new heritage of those kinds of buildings. See, over here, I don't think it's going to happen. I think the Gherkin probably is forever the Gherkin. So there are some advantages from a heritage point of view of not bringing it to a specific company, but anyway, your turn.
My turn.
That's a good answer, Carmine, but can we draw you on, I mean, would you like to say which building in London has most chance of being embraced into the tall building, into the psyche in the same way that Sears has in Chicago?
Well, I think it's already happened. I think the Gherkin is that building.
Okay.
Certainly from a American point of view. I mean, it just the imagery of it alone on the skyline makes it unique. The Shard obviously sticks up and stands above everything else. His building is beautiful and will house a competitor of ours that's not really as good as us.
It is taller.
But it is taller.
Richard,
we have more
can we
space.
draw you on this question?
My view would be, and Peter touched on a lot of this, that the heritage is really in the wider sense of place, if you like. So if you look at the cluster, if you look at that whole area, if you look at the shot we saw on the video, shows the Leadenhall building, sitting alongside, if you like, the Gherkin. You see the Heron Tower. You have the perspective of 20 Fenchurch Street. You've got the Willis building. I would suggest that cluster is what creates the sense of place, and that area is what gives it the heritage. You see more and more. We've seen in the construction of the Leadenhall building, you are seeing people at the weekends in the city visiting those locations. These buildings have a huge sort of global following, and as a result of that, they're becoming places to go and to look at the buildings. You genuinely do see people stand in the street and point at these. So I would argue that in the future, going to Prince Charles's comments, if you can create that sense of place in an area which has become apparent with the cluster, I think that's what will give it its heritage, and that the buildings are obviously very different in their design, but they are relatively complementary to each other. And of course, if you ask me a specific building, I'm going to be very biased now, but I think the Gherkin it sort of has led the way, really. As Peter said, it is what it is for various reasons, but I think it really does give that whole location a real address. People are very familiar with it, and it draws people there in the first instance, and the buildings being built around it complement it.